sensitivity. This is going to be really a fun presentation. It's kind of an interactive presentation. But before we start, some housekeeping matters. This information here in this webinar will be recorded. And if you do not wish to be recorded, then this is the time for you to kind of exit the webinar and read our as we get them posted on our YouTube site. So I'm really kind of excited about this presentation about securing your documents and document sensitivity. It's been a lot of fun putting it together. For those who don't know me, my name is Matt Katzer. I'm the CEO of KAMIND IT, and we are a managed Microsoft security service provider. And we also look and use document sensitivity, some of the other features that we actually have here today. So when I was putting this presentation together, some interesting things happen. We're at the time of the year when Microsoft changes everything, and they're releasing the new Purview portal, for instance. And so there's a bunch of AI tools and everything else. I've done an interesting combination of a little bit of education, some screenshots of different activity. But what I'm going to try to do today is basically run us through some interactive demos. So we'll see how this actually works. For those who don't know KAMIND, a little bit about us. We're a direct Microsoft licensed reseller. We're also one of the 42 partners in the US that actually offers the secured subscriptions to Azure Government and Office 365. We're also we're aligned in terms of our security process, our security model for both our commercial clients and our government clients around the NIST 800-171 security standard. It's a cybersecurity model that basically is becoming the base model for a lot of states, any institution and federal organization. And just from background 365, we're a cloud-first company, and we've been that way. We've migrated over 100,000 users, probably close to more 200,000 by this time, plus at least 400 companies Office 365. But let's get through and let's start talking about a couple things, like what is Microsoft Purview? And before we actually kind of tell you what Microsoft Purview is, we need to actually take a step back and look at what we're trying to solve and the problems that we actually have. And it's really about data, and data is complex. There's really, when you think about traditional security, the traditional ComSec environments, for instance, you were thinking about you have a building, you have a guard at the door, and information stays within that building. That's not the case today. Everything is everywhere. And there's really is no borders of the business. The borders of the business is the device, and the access to the device is you, the user identity. And that's how everything is actually happening. And when you look in terms of trying to manage this and trying to look in terms of what's going on in your organization, it really is, you have a very difficult time. And when you look at the regulations that we actually have to follow through and what we actually have to do, it's extremely difficult because we have to control devices. You have bring your own devices, you have corporate owned devices, and data is just growing, it's changing. The regulations are constantly changing, even for ourselves in the IT industries. You know, as we look in terms of how we're actually managing in terms of government, for instance, we have new regulations that are placed on us and how we do things and make sure we have proof of execution, that we can prove what we actually done for clients. And which is actually a good thing, I think, for the IT industry. And we're taking those type of capabilities and rolling those into what we handle for our commercial customers. And the days are gone before you can just set it and do it. You have to really manage information. And that's really key. And what's really complicates this is you look the way that the landscape is changing, how we actually have to handle data. We got exposure gaps. We have areas of regulatory requirements now. Like, for instance, when we talk about like the NIST 800-171, which is the regulation for non-federal systems, you know, commercial systems such as ours, that's now becoming the standard as it's being pushed into the, you know, FTC, the SEC is using the in terms of HHS is using it. You're seeing all these types of daisy chains of regulations and what we actually have to do as IT providers, and also as business owners are basically managers of our data estates. And we have to deal with all the transform. We have to deal with audits. We have to deal with issues as if something does happen where you have a data exposure. We deal with brand reputation at risk. There's a lot of issues. It's not a simple environment that we have, and you have to start looking at the different tools. And when you look across trying to figure out what to use, it's basically very difficult. I mean, even for ourselves that we're Microsoft service provider, and we're into 100% of the Microsoft stack. Even ourselves, we have multi-clouds, we have SaaS products. We don't have any servers on site. Everything's in Azure and everything's into a SaaS service, but we're using probably 5 or 6 different SaaS services to run our business. And it's very difficult to actually manage these things. And that's where it's interesting with Purview and how Purview is actually entered into the market by Microsoft, because what it gives you this comprehensive solution that helps you really do really 4 things. It wants to govern data, put that governance control in place. You want to protect that data. You want to manage it because you need to manage the life cycle in terms of your data estate that you actually have. And that's really critical when you look at when you look at what's going on with Purview. And I'm trying to give you this overview because we're talking about document sensitivity, but document sensitivity is a subset of what Purview sets up. In order to actually understand and do document sensitivity, you have to understand the data that you have, and you have to understand where it is and what's a risk posture associated. Because how are you going to set up sensitivity labels for an environment if you don't know where it is, or if you don't know what the risk is? Are you setting the right levels? And then we add the other factors in terms of what's happening in terms of risk and compliance and unified data governance. You have the whole AI management. How do you actually manage AI? How do you actually look in terms of how AI tools are set in place, how people are querying types of activities, and how you can actually build the information? And yeah, that's right. When you look in terms of organization now, in terms of AI, if the chat GPT or using different types of products, you have to basically manage the activity. You have to manage what's actually being done by the employees in the organization because you're required to manage for risk. You're looking for insider threats. You're looking for basically, you could have harassment issues. There's all sorts of things. You could have data theft. All these things are critical that you have to manage in today's environment. And that's what Purview gives you. And, Purview in terms of changing, it gives you this dashboard to really see what your posture looks like and what the pieces are and everything else. And the first part, when you actually look at Purview, and when you actually go and access Purview, it's at purview.microsoft.com, and you have to access with a Microsoft 365 E5 software package. And to give you a feeling for it, I'll give you some quick shots of what Purview, and then I think we're going to go to an interactive demo after we go through the AI portion. But basically, Purview gives you this dashboard in terms of what you want to look at, in terms of the pieces. Are you actually looking in terms of what is your data? What's your data warehouses look like? What types of data services? Are you on Azure? Are you on AWS? Are you on third-party private hosting systems? How do you actually, what's your information protection policies? What's your data policies? And the latest one we're looking at is what is AI? So these are the things that you actually have to deal with now. And for you're looking at in terms of doing document classification, you want to actually start load up Purview, and you want to enable the data classification portals. And there's some setup required to do it. But you get through the pieces as you've seen here. We actually looking at this is looking at the AI hub through Purview. We actually now seeing the data and the different data sets. How many queries are being used on the analytics? You're catching all that information in place. And you're also trying to, and right here at a glance, you see on the right-hand side on the data labels. So when you start looking at your organization deploying AI tools, you have to look at it from a standpoint, how do you actually build these pieces out? How do you actually build the environment so you can actually do what you actually need to do? And that's the key of it, is the various pieces. And then you also have to look in terms of how it's being used in the organization for AI. not only looking in terms of there's behaviors that AI can easily be used, it could be ethical or unethical. There's rules and regulations around this. And you, as a manager of that data estate now, you have to actually concern yourself with those. And that's where Purview comes in terms of the policies and setting this up. And this is kind of the, wanted to give you kind of an overview of this piece so you can understand the data classification better. So when you start looking at like AI tools, for instance, like this is unethical behavior in Copilot, you start paying attention to what's the queries are being done in the organization. Because as the rules and regulations have put in place, as we put more power into our end users to do what they need to do, we still have to manage those environments and we still have to have the necessary policy and procedures in place to actually kind of make sure we address the issues and regulations that were covered. And that's what you actually have in terms of when you do Purview. And you really are trying to look at this whole data security, create these policies, figure out what labels that you need to put in place, what labels you need to actually have, and how data is being accessed in the organization. And that's really the specifics as you look at it, because data security with AI and label classification and document sensitivity is all tied together. And as you look in terms of trying to understand activity, what's done in the organization, and here in this case, I have removed names, so they're removed, but you can actually see the AI tools that are being used when the information in terms of what's actually, what data has been referenced on it and where sensitive files access. Now, this is extremely important because as we go through and we look like in our case, we're dealing with Department of Defense stuff, but you could also deal with in terms of a banking environment. What you have here is you're actually trying to understand what is the classification. Has someone tried to access a restricted file? Are they doing data analysis on it? Because you have to basically log those things. You have to basically maintain an access control record. This is the life that we're living in now, and that's what you actually look in terms of the different applications on it. Now, there's other features you have in terms of Purview. Now, in terms of different capabilities, you got audits, you have communication set, compliance environment, other type of activity. And the key thing to keep in mind is I wanted to highlight this one, settings. If you're starting Purview for the first time, there's some permissions that you're going to have to grant and access. And it's one of the difficult things of starting Purview is figuring out how do I enable certain things? How do I give permissions? You want to look for the settings on the home page. So there's a kind of a quick insight for you. So as you look in terms of the pieces on Purview, you get some of the different ideas on what it actually has. And the whole point of what we're trying to do in terms of how we're managing things is really this whole concept of understanding and trying to understand and govern the data that we actually have. Now, there's capabilities in terms of data map. As you go to the organization, you're building out your infrastructure, you're building out your labels. You got to have labels. You got to understand where those labels are. Why do you have certain labels? So you need to actually data map your organization and understanding where things align. That's where you need the capabilities and Purview provides for it. You got to catalog information. So it's not just mapping the stuff. You got to curate. You got to figure out what's going on and get a linear visualization of what you actually have. Because as you look and define an organization structure, and we'll talk more about some steps of how to do labeling in a few minutes, it's basically trying to get the necessary policies in place and know that you're going to be able to govern the information basically on an intelligent model. And that's what you have in terms of information protection or data loss protection, or even slide when we talk about risk management. And like right here, here's a case of a data mine using the insider risk management, looking for, inappropriate text. So organizations now have to be constantly aware what is done in the main emails. What type of structure do you have? Is there target or harassment in place? Do you have profanity in messages? All those things are required because regulations are forcing us to basically make sure we put the right HR policies in place and we actually address them. And that's extremely important when organizations, so now you're looking at labels, you're looking at risk management, you're looking at other activities. It's all interrelated because that's what you have to track and that's what you have to open up at. And then the final piece that you have with labels, it's really trying to get an understanding of, the data lifecycle management. How is the data going to survive? What labels are being applied? What data is going to be expired? When you start deploying, deploying like Microsoft Copilot, you put labels in the environment. You're going to have to seriously look at what data do you keep, what data do you index, what data do you label? Do you have a label put in place that you have for restricted data that you don't want people to access or index? Because you're looking at it from an organization standpoint of how you want to manage, how you want to make things easy for folks. And that's really crucial. And of course, you have some of the compliance and risk exposures that we have that gives you kind of purview, gives you that analysis of the pieces that goes on so you get a better overview of what's happening in the organization. And this is all part of when you look at labels. And it seems we're taking a long way to go about this, but basically, when you look at labels, you're trying to look at a label strategy to deal with all these issues, to deal with things about how people access information, and you want to be able to use that in different forms. As example, you want to basically make sure you have ability to how you do e-discovery, how you want to have, what type of information people access. On the earlier e-discoveries, they would ask you in terms of discovery order, you have to search and provide everything you have access to. But if you have proprietary information that a person that's being under a discovery order doesn't have access, don't you want to have the ability to basically block that information so you legally don't have to turn it over? That's how you that's what you start looking at labels, and you look at it from a bigger picture. You're looking at access, and it's really comes back down to that one old axiom they used to say, it's the need to know. If folks don't need to know the information, don't provide it because you're trying to reduce a business scope. And of course, you have the other features of audit, for instance, and everything else. Now, I wanted to give you that kind of overview on the pieces, and we went through rather quickly on it, but I want to spend more time on the sensitivity labels, because that's really what we're talking about. And when you talk about Purview sensitivity labels, it really is setting about what structure do you put in place so that you can actually manage the information, and that's what it is. And you come up with this whole this whole concept. Do you have a strategy in mind? Now, this sounds simple, but what happens a lot of times when we talked about people, when we talk to other clients, we talk about their engineers being implementing or data analysts, is they really set back and say, oh, I just been told I have to put labels in something, but I really I really wasn't privy to what's the strategy. So when you're thinking about document sensitivity, you're thinking about labels, you're thinking about data classifications, you have to have a strategy. What are you trying to accomplish? Who are you trying to give access information to? Who are you trying to not give access information? What happens to that information as it travels out of the organization? What happens to the information when it comes in? As an example, we deal with, federal contractors, for instance. There's a data type known as CUI, confidential unclassified information. It's supplied by the government. The regulations require that we need to know where that data resides in the organization. We need to know who has access to the information, who has basically transmitted that information external to the organization, and how to make sure that information is not provided to people who don't have a need to know. That's the strategy. Those are the things that you have to put in place. And it's super, super important. So the first step of any document discovery or document classification is the strategy. You need to have a strategy. And you need to align the strategy in terms of what organizations also need to do when the data lives throughout the life cycle. What is it? How long do you keep data? How long do you not keep data? How do you build the classification labels around so you actually kind of get rid of data after a period of time? And so all these things come in place, all this information you need to do to follow. And the whole course about what we try to do with everything, it's about safeguarding the information. We're trying to prevent data loss. That's the reason why we're doing labelings. We're trying to protect sensitive data to isolate it to those that have the need to know. And we want to manage insider risk. Those individuals, or we may have bad actors that get inside our organizations that basically are that may hire or have penetrated through our security defenses, and we're trying to make sure that we don't have a situation where we exfiltrate data that should never have been left the organization. So you think about all those things. And documentation classification, it's about really these four things. You got to know your data. You got to know where it is. And you have to put the necessary controls in place to protect it. And you have to prevent the data loss, put the structure to detect risk behavior, accidental spillage. And you're going to have to govern the data. And that's the pieces that you need to do when you do Purview. Now, when you look at specifically on doing Purview, on doing document classification, what does it really look like from a user standpoint? It's actually pretty simple. What you're really doing is defining these type of characteristics. What type of classifications do I have in the organization? And typically organizations have between 4 to 6 classifications that are kind of the normal classifications that are applied. And as you get into more detail, what happens is you may actually have additional classification for project space that live and die for a project. But this is the type of things that you actually do. So when you actually see like an Excel spreadsheet, for instance, you have, or any of the Microsoft application, it's also a lot of third party now because the document classification is standard. Adobe, for instance, follows in terms of the Microsoft classification. It's basically it's an industry standard of how things are done. And it gets in terms of outlook, in terms of information that's happened. So you can actually do different types of announcements in terms of pieces and everything else. And this little tab over here, you see this is the sensitivity. Now you can set up labels in such a way, so if you receive a label that have a certain level of sensitivity, then it's going to have to go out at that level of sensitivity or higher. It depends. So there's controls and rules, and I'm going to show you how to set that up. So really, those are the things you're doing. So you think of it, you step back in the organization, look at the bigger picture in terms of what you're trying to do and how you want to manage information. And then you take labels and you put labels as a strategy to figure out the pieces on it. And the steps for a good label, it's really simple. You see this one right up here? You have to enable the AI data mining because you got to know where your data is going to be and you have to understand what's being searched. Then after you kind of put those pieces in place, it's really define the label classification. What types of general data classifications do you want to have? And then do you do a different type of special projects for limited time scope? And then you also look at label in terms of how you're going to do intercompany access and restrictions. And then it's like on the third step is you deploy the label, deploy sample labels, and you test out the label. And that's how to basically do the structure and everything else. Now, when I go into Purview, this is the Purview portal. You notice over here, the first time I said, hey, let's go in the AI portal. Well, this way we're going to the information protection portal. Now you notice this settings here because sometimes you don't have permissions to do various things depending who you are. And Purview has a very granular permission. So in order to add permission or changes, settings is your friend, and that's what you have to find to go use. So the first thing you do when you actually go in the information portal, you get this analysis of what's going on. You have basically terms of what they provide in terms of capabilities to figure out how to register as CLAN, different data sources, how to scan your data sources on it, and understand the pieces that you actually have. And then basically what Purview would give you in terms of report analysis of what's going on in terms of your organization, what's been encrypted, what's been labeled, what is not labeled. Those are the things that you're going to see from a dashboard. And you start building these pieces out. The next step as you drill down in terms of gives you that overview, overview selection, is you can scroll down some more in terms of how the data is being structured and how the labels are being applied. So you understand that what type of labels are in place. This is kind of a small one that we had put in place in our demo tenants. So we have like, what's customer confidential, where is being scanned, how much encrypted data is in place. All this information, because when you actually do labels, you have to understand how folks are using it. And there also is an area distribution map that you see in terms of what you actually have in terms of different types of where the data is located, what sources you're trying to find. And that's what you're getting at. And then when you actually look at the labels, for instance, like what we're going to do is we're going to walk through the configuration of a sensitivity label and talk about some of these features. And if you have some questions and everything, just put them in the chat and I'll make sure that we get to them. But basically we have in this case, in the sample, we have like 5 sensitivity labels that we have. And then this is a detail. I selected this KAMIND IT confidential one, and it gives you the detail on the label on it. And it's actually a pretty straightforward wizard that you actually have in terms of what is a label priority, how does it, what's the description for it? What is the description for admins? Because there may be different levels. And also we have this label color that you can assign to a label. So it gives you a different perspective. Then you start defining the scope. Now, getting back what I remembered earlier, what's the strategy? What's the scope? Define what type of organization labels you want to have. Once you do that, then you can actually go through and start defining the scope. In this case, this one covers everything. It covers files, emails, meetings, groups, and sites. And then also in terms of what it actually has. So I'm really trying to be very specific of where this label particularly is targeted at. And that's the strategy you have to keep in mind. And as you look through the wizard, you start saying, well, geez, how do I want it? Well, I want to have controlled access over this label. I want to have content marking. There with custom header or something associated with that. We use custom footers, not necessarily the diagonal confidential on documents. And also you want to make sure that what's in our team's chats is protected. So that's limited. So you can't have and because you're dealing with both insider and outsider threats, because you don't want to have, if you're having private chats in an organization, you don't want to have those chats basically taken from one group to another if it's dealing information that's very private to the organization, has critical patent information, all sorts of other things. Because I bring patent information out because I actually own a lot of patents. And one of the things that folks have to be careful of when they actually apply for patents is where they actually put their patents, which email system they have, and who has access to information. Because if you actually have that information distributed earlier, when you're going through a patent process, you may actually find that you inadvertently disclose the information. So there's controls that you need to put in place. Again, this comes back down. What's the strategy for the label? What are you trying to accomplish? And what are timing controls that you put on? That's super critical, important. And then also we have in terms of label, in terms of what happens. In this case, I'm saying, hey, this is enforcing that this particular label will not allow be forward, but we're adding capabilities to user assign additional permission. Those are different decisions that you have. And so you're looking at what's the use of it. But again, how to figure this out. What's the strategy? What do you want to accomplish? How do you actually want to locate and classify your data? Got to think about all these things at the time before you just start looking at it. Content marking, you can add watermarks, for instance, and headers. We typically use footers on ours, but it's all different in terms of which organizations that you like to have. I've seen it both ways. Sometimes I don't like watermarks across document because even though it's great, sometimes you're having pictures or other things, it's hard to read what's going on. But you have to decide what makes sense for yourself because every organization's different. For Teams meeting and chats, you have ability to control And who can bypass the lobby, who has, so you have to have a private Teams meeting. You have the ability to control who's invited, how the meetings run, and who has permissions to do what. This is beyond what your corporate structure would be for a Teams meeting. You may have different controls. This is a compliance structure based on the sensitivity label. So again, what's the strategy? What are you trying to accomplish? You have to think about all those things, and you have to think about who's going to be using the data and everything else. And the same is like auto labeling. You want to auto labeling filter files and emails that come in because it's quite honestly easier. And then you basically look in terms of protection settings that you have. And you look at all this information as you kind of define the sensitivity label. And then basically you also have defined the privacy for internal and external users. And you have that capability as well. And that gives you, in terms of different features like conditional access, you can put in place. And all these features. Now, there's other things that happen as well that make aware of, because you notice in this one, it says, oh, just allow users to do their thing, but I really didn't define how I wanted to have teams. Purview is smart enough to basically say that it's going to fail a validation test and make you make changes. So that's the other interesting thing. You can actually, Purview will actually structure what you want to do and what you want to accomplish. And it gives you the assets and everything else. And then if you're ready to actually run to the whole organization, you auto label it. But if you're going to just do a test, you basically submit a label. You keep this feature turned off because you can always edit the label and turn it back on. And then you go through the training program necessary and get a summary what the label. So what does some of these things look like in real life? Well, here's one where basically we have the sensitivity label here. I marked this is a Microsoft price list of showing the different prices of Teams and e-discovery licenses and everything depending on how you purchase. This is standard pricing that's available for Microsoft on the web. In this case, I decided this was a simple example to show how to take a document. We're going to mark this document confidential. And then what you actually have is you get you get this restricted access permission workshop. Remember, one of the options I selected in the sensitivity label was allow the users to make changes. Those are the things that you need to do. Those are what the strategy. So you have to think about what the usage is and what makes sense on it. And then basically, once you actually implement label and test it, it's really coming down to managing the data. You're managing in terms of what data that you actually have and how you're being used and how that's data being used. Now, what we've done at KAMIND, we have the Microsoft Purview, which gives you one view of data. We also have our KAMIND Guard Plus tool, which we also use to give another view of data. And so we actually look in terms of how we actually process that information to see the pieces on it. So we get really get a good understanding about how data is being used. Again, you're looking back at the strategy, what you want to accomplish, how you actually run the different pieces into it, and how you look at data analysis. And we've been using Guard Plus as our audit tool in conjunction with tools like Purview to manage and control and visual so we can look at it from a management standpoint. So looking at Purview, what is the things you really need to do? What is the next steps? Well, first of all, you got to have an MS365 E5 and for the license, and you're going to have to give yourself permissions on it. As a global admin, you'll have to change your permissions and basically set up as an organization admin. And then you basically go to purview.microsoft.com. And what happens, this will look in your tenant and you basically sign up and make sure you sign up for the new preview portal because this is the portal that we're using. So expect this, don't use the old one. And then that's how you get started. And it's really this, looking at these 6 steps. You want to deploy at least one MS365. You want to deploy Copilot. You need at least 10 to enable the AI Hub. And this is really crucial that you put this in place as soon as you can, because the whole goal of this is getting the data mining in place so you can actually see what's going on in the organization and you can start making decisions on what your label strategy is going to be. And then you're going to we use Guard Plus, for instance, to build out policies. It comes with a bunch of default policies and it builds those out so we can start doing the necessary data collection. Then you start up Purview at Microsoft.com as part of your MS365 license. And you need to go through an initialization process. They have a wizard that will help you walk through each of these things. And you really understand what your search. Remember that question I told you earlier about strategy? You need to understand what you're searching, what your data is. And once you understand that, then come up with your classification. And typically classification will have like 5 major classes. And reason why you want to look at classes that are the general classes and don't go more than 5, there's a lot of studies about how a human brain works. You know, we have a habit of thinking in terms of threes. You go to 4 or 5, that's about the limit, and people can't make decisions once you go back. And you keep them in that 3 to 5 range, people can make decision, understand what you're trying to do. But if you go exceed that, then you can't make decisions. And then the other aspect for label is come up in terms of what is your strategy as an organization to do special projects that are limited time and scope. So you may have may have the Willamette project, for instance, and you'll have a label associated with that. And then you'll have a data structure set in place where you basically will atrophy that data over a period of time once it's no longer needed. And then also whatever intercompany access and restrictions. Again, what groups have permissions, what groups don't have permission, who can add labels, who cannot add labels. You can add those features into it. And then it's really that you deploy a sample label, you test out the label, and if it works, you go put it in production. It's that simple. So with that, we went through a lot of information. I'm going to open up for questions in a few minutes. And really, it's really a couple of things. You can go to the Microsoft website on Purview and at, Microsoft.com, Microsoft Purview. We have the Guard Plus data analytics tool. We have a free 30-day trial that you can run that. And also just reach out and contact us. Like you go to our website at KAMIND.com, just book a meeting with a consultant. Now, what I'd like to do is if you enjoyed this material, please go to our KAMIND.com feedback and let's see what additional questions that you would have. So with that, what questions would folks have? Is there anything that you'd like to see or talk about? We have some time left, and I just want to make sure that we got your questions answered. And I just want to walk through some of the things that in the meantime, here, remember this magic button settings? That's the button you want to use to basically make sure you see the pieces associated with it. But really, as you look through, Purview, it really is trying to understand what you actually have. This is a demo system, so I don't have a lot of things built up, but you can see it can actually data mine in terms of Azure subscription, block storage for data. It looks in terms of, information protection in terms of access. We'll see if I set my permissions up. Yes, I did. So you can actually see the reports necessary, what recommendations they come out. And more important, you start building out your sensitivity labels that you actually want to have in the organization. And you start looking in terms of what you want to control and what you want to have. These are all demo sites, so you turn everything on by definition. And you get an idea, so you see email structure, everything else, what type of labeling is. You have an auto publishing label that you can port the organization, how you actually validate everything, and you have full access into the organization, so you put the pieces in place. So it's really just it really comes down to how do you want to set it up, but you have to have a structure associated with it. So it's like, and then we have to add a location rule. Let's say content contains, yeah, that's fine. Let's say Tom. I think there's a group in this case that we actually have. So you can get an idea of what the different labels rules that you actually have. And then you go through in terms of policies and that you actually have in terms of the organization. Then you can actually load the data map, set the policies, define the classifier, trainable classifiers, which is leveraging the AI engines, for instance. You want to take advantage of that in terms of what type of AI that you're ready to use. So you can actually run, this case, we can actually kick off and start this trainable classifier. So you have different ways that you can classify information. It's all contained in how you want to do things. So with that, that's kind of the key things and pieces that you look at. The key one is first way you want to start is really activate your Purview Audit AI Hub. It's very important that you have that in place. And with that, if there's no questions, I'm going to say, give thank you for everyone for joining us today. And if you have any additional questions, please go to our website at www.kamind.com and please select schedule a consult with one of our account managers, and we'll be able to help you and address your data classifications. Thanks again for attending, and look forward to working with all of you later on this year.